Let's take a look at a complex study from 2018 by Argawal. This study focuses on whether retrieval can be used with higher order thinking skills prior to lower order thinking skills. Note that this study contains 3 different experiments, but we will only be covering the first 2 experiments because they both work with college students. Before diving into the study, we will need to cover some important concepts that will be mentioned throughout this video. Before we begin discussing the study, you need to understand how the study differentiates higher order and lower order thinking. You may be familiar already with Bloom's revised taxonomy, which shows how different levels of thinking and learning are hierarchically categorized. Lower order thinking skills are at the bottom of the pyramid, and higher order thinking skills are higher in the pyramid. Note that this study considers understanding and remembering as lower order thinking skills, while applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating are higher order thinking skills. Because this is posed as a pyramid, there is an assumption that lower order thinking skills must precede the higher order thinking skills. This study tries to find out, when using retrieval, if lower order thinking must precede higher order thinking. Generally speaking, college students are often challenged to use higher order thinking skills, such as applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. If you want to know more about Bloom's revised taxonomy, such as what qualifies as creating, please use the link in the SWAY module. Next, let's cover the 2 terms the study uses very often. There are 2 important terms that will appear throughout this video. The first is fact-based quizzes. This refers to retrieval that relies on remembering and understanding, which make up the lower order thinking skills of Bloom's revised taxonomy. The second important term is higher order thinking quizzes. This refers to retrieval that relies on applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating that make up the higher order thinking skills of Bloom's revised taxonomy. Remember that quizzes are a form of retrieval. Students must retrieve information from memory in order to answer the quiz questions. Next, we'll discuss the details of Experiment 1. Experiment 1 focused on college students in a psychology department. They've read through 8 different readings in English that presented 2 different opinions or arguments per reading. The students were assessed through 2 different types of multiple choice quizzes: fact-based quizzes, which rely on remembering and understanding, and higher order thinking quizzes, which rely on applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. If you would like to see the difference between the questions that use lower order or higher order thinking skills, I would encourage you to take a look at the study, which can be accessed through the link in the SWAY. We will discuss how the readings and quizzes were used shortly. First, we'll discuss the key research questions the researchers wanted to answer in Experiment 1. There were 2 main research questions that the researchers wanted to answer with Experiment 1. The first question was, does fact-based retrieval improve higher order thinking retrieval? Remember that fact-based quizzes and higher order thinking quizzes are forms of retrieval. The second question was, does rereading improve retrieval? Remember from earlier in this module that rereading is not as effective as retrieval. We'll now take a closer look at how Experiment 1 was organized to see how the researchers tried to produce answers to these questions. Experiment 1 was divided into 2 sessions. Let's look what happened in Session 1. First, all of the students read 8 different passages. For 2 of the passages, all the students read them once, and then they were not tested on it. For another 2 of the passages, all the students read them twice, and then they were not tested on it. For another 2 of the passages, all the students read them once, and then they took a fact-based quiz on it, without being able to refer back to the reading. For another 2 of the passages, all the students read them once, and then they took a higher order thinking quiz on it, again without being able to refer back to the reading. Remember, the quizzes act as retrieval, so to sum up, for 2 readings, students had no retrieval. For another 2 readings, students reread, but with no retrieval. For another 2 readings, the students used fact-based retrieval, and for the final 2 readings, the students used higher order thinking retrieval. That's what happened in Session 1. Let's move on to Session 2, which occurred 2 days later. Session 2 divided the students up into 2 conditions, which you will see on the right side. The students either took a fact-based quiz based about the reading, or they took a higher-order thinking quiz about the reading. This condition happened for each set of 2 readings. So, for example, on the 2 passages that students read once and were not quizzed on in session 1, they either took a fact-based quiz or a higher-order thinking quiz on it. This continued for the rest of the passages. In other words, some students ended up taking 2 fact-based quizzes spaced 2 days apart. Some took 2 higher-order thinking quizzes spaced 2 days apart. Some took a fact-based quiz first, and then a higher-order thinking quiz spaced 2 days apart. Some students took a higher-order thinking quiz first, and then a fact-based quiz spaced 2 days apart. Some students ended up just taking 1 fact-based quiz or 1 higher-order thinking quiz 2 days after reading the passages. Next, we're going to look at the results of the study. This is a complicated graph, so let's cover the meanings of the labels first. The top colors show what the students did for the readings from session 1. For example, the blue means the passages that students read once and had no quiz on in session 1. The bottom labels show the quiz type from session 2. There are 2 separate graphs, one for those who took the fact-based quiz in session 2, and one for those who took the higher-order thinking quiz in session 2. The percentages are the average percent for correct answers of students in the quizzes. If you look at the read/study once, the blue bar, on the final fact quiz graph, we can see that the students who read 2 passages once and had no retrieval in session 1 had an average score of 54% when they took the fact-based quiz in session 2. Now that you understand how to read the graph, we'll break the graph down to the 3 most important results for experiment 1. Rereading without retrieval was not very effective. Note how in the read/study once, the blue bar, and the read/study twice, the orange bar, that scores were at about 50% across both types of quizzes from session 2. Remember, rereading is not retrieval. These results support the literature that rereading is not the best way to remember material. 2. Taking a fact-based quiz and then taking another fact-based quiz 2 days later improves scores on the second quiz. Similarly, taking a higher-order thinking quiz and then 2 days later taking another higher-order thinking quiz improves scores on the second quiz. This makes sense because the quizzes are similar in structure and even content. Students expect similar types of questions. 3. Taking a fact-based quiz and then 2 days later taking a higher-order thinking quiz does not improve the second quiz score. This suggests that perhaps fact-based retrieval is not necessary prior to higher-order thinking-based retrieval. This also suggests that perhaps higher-order thinking can precede fact-based knowledge or lower-order thinking skills. Now is a good time to pause the video, digest what you've heard and watched, and take a little break before we move on to experiment 2. Okay, let's now discuss experiment 2. It is very similar to the previous experiment. It also used college students from the psychology department, but they were different students from the last experiment. The same English readings presenting 2 sides of an argument were used again. This time, there were 3 different assessment types: fact-based quizzes, higher-order thinking quizzes, and mixed quizzes, which contained both fact-based and higher-order thinking questions. Let's see what research questions the researchers wanted to answer in this experiment. There were 2 main research questions that the researchers wanted to answer with experiment 2. The first question was, does fact-based retrieval improve higher-order thinking retrieval? This is the same question that was in experiment 1. The second question was, does using retrieval for both higher and lower-order thinking skills improve higher-order thinking retrieval? This is why mixed quizzes were implemented this time. Experiment 2 was divided into 2 sessions, just like experiment 1. Let's look at what happened in session 1. First, all of the students read 8 different passages, exactly the same as experiment 1. For 2 of the passages, all the students read them once and took a higher order thinking quiz. For another 2 of the passages, all the students read them once and took 2 higher order thinking quizzes. For another 2 of the passages, all the students read them once and then took 2 fact-based quizzes. For another 2 of the passages, all the students read them once and then they took a fact-based quiz and a higher order thinking quiz. Again, the quizzes act as retrieval. That's what happened in session 1. Let's move on to session 2, which occurred 2 days later. For experiment 2, the students were separated into the 2 same conditions for session 2 as in experiment 1, which you can see on the right side. They took either a fact-based quiz on the reading, or they took a higher order thinking quiz on the reading. This condition happened for each set of 2 readings. So, for example, on the 2 passages that students read once and took 2 fact-based quizzes on in session 1, they took either a fact-based quiz or a higher order thinking quiz on it in session 2. This continued for all of the other reading passages. Again, very similar to experiment 1. What is different in experiment 2 is that some students had more retrieval practice than others, those who took 2 quizzes in session 1. When we look at the results, we'll see which retrieval in session 1 helped on the fact-based and the higher order thinking quizzes in session 2. This is another complicated graph for experiment 2. But if you understood the graph for experiment 1, this is quite similar. Reading it is quite similar to experiment 1, so we will skip describing the graph's labels. Let's break it down to the most important results. The matching quiz type had the highest score. In other words, fact-based retrieval helped improve scores on a matching final fact quiz. Likewise, higher order thinking retrieval improves scores for higher order thinking quizzes. This makes sense because the quizzes are similar in structure. Students expect similar questions. These are similar results to experiment 1. 2. Look at the graph on the right for the final higher order thinking quiz. Note how the orange bar is higher than the blue bar. Students who practice higher order thinking retrieval twice prior to the higher order thinking quiz in session 2 did better than those who only practiced once. In fact, students' average scores improved by 8% simply by taking another quiz, or using retrieval again. This again supports literature that repeated retrieval can help improve memory. We've covered the important findings and results from experiment 2. Let's discuss the overall problems with this study next. Let's talk about some problems with the study. This study tries to argue that fact-based knowledge does not need to precede higher order thinking. This study does not necessarily prove or support this because of the next 2 problems. The experiments used college students, who likely have more extensive fact-based knowledge as adults, and may have developed some higher order thinking skills already. Thus, we cannot know for sure whether or not lower order thinking skills must precede higher order thinking skills. Furthermore, some fact-based knowledge may be necessary to help facilitate higher order thinking. For example, understanding what certain symbols mean is fact-based knowledge. Without certain fact-based knowledge, it can be very difficult to use higher order thinking skills. Let's conclude this video with the key takeaways. Why do these experiments matter for learning assistance? Remember from experiment 1 that students that reread material without retrieval did not perform as well as those who used retrieval. Also remember that students who practice retrieval with matching question type, in other words, higher order thinking quiz in session 1 and then a higher order thinking quiz in session 2, performed better. If we want students to effectively study for a test, they should practice using retrieval. However, they also need to ask themselves, what types of questions do I need to answer? If you only practice retrieval on remembering tasks, such as definitions, then you will struggle on higher order thinking questions. This is because you have not practiced retrieval for such questions. For learning assistance, we need to be able to help students find questions that require higher order thinking, and then have them practice using retrieval on them. We could also create questions that require higher order thinking and have students practice answering them.